It's wild, isn't it? How you can build a whole life, brick by brick, with someone you trust completely, only to wake up one day and realize the entire foundation was a lie. 2 years. That's how long my wife, Chloe, pretended we were trying for a baby. 2 years of shared hopes, heartbreaks, and doctor's appointments that never quite happened, all while she was secretly on birth control. And by the time I finally pieced it together, I'd gathered enough evidence to make sure she wouldn't just walk away from our marriage, but she'd be lucky to walk away with anything at all. My name is Mark, I'm 32, and I'm an aerospace engineer in Texas. That means my days are all about math, data, and logic. My life has always been pretty straightforward, maybe even a little predictable. And honestly, I liked it that way. I had a good job, a house I'd worked hard for, savings in the bank, and a clear plan for the future. I wasn't the kind of guy chasing wild adventures. I was the guy who showed up on time, paid his bills early, and actually read the instruction manual. Some people called me boring, but the people who mattered called me reliable, and I was more than okay with that trade-off. I'd seen too many friends crash and burn living like every weekend was spring break. I met Chloe 3 years ago at a charity 5K that my company sponsored. I wasn't even planning to talk to anyone that day, just wanted my free t-shirt and to support the cause. She was at a booth handing out water bottles, and when I walked up, she flashed this amazing smile and said I looked way too put together for someone who'd just run 3 miles in the Texas heat. I made some dumb joke about aerospace engineers being built for precision, not speed, and somehow that led to us talking for 20 minutes. We covered everything from her job as a dental hygienist to my work on satellite components, and even debated if breakfast burritos counted as a legitimate recovery meal. She had this energy that just made everything feel lighter, like she could find something interesting in the most mundane conversation. By the time I left that booth, I knew I was going to ask for her number. Our first date was at this cozy little Italian place downtown. Nothing fancy, just perfect. I remember thinking she was exactly the kind of person I'd been hoping to find, genuinely interested in building something real, not just playing games. We talked about families, careers, what we wanted out of life. And she mentioned, more than once, how she'd always pictured herself as a mom someday. That really stuck with me, because I wanted kids too, always had. Meeting someone who shared that vision felt like finding the last piece of a puzzle I'd been working on for years. Things moved pretty naturally after that. We dated for about a year, got engaged, then married at her parents' ranch just outside Plano. Her dad, Robert, was this retired firefighter with a big personality and an even bigger handshake. Her mom, Susan, was the type who'd have coffee ready before you even finished saying good morning. They welcomed me into their family like I'd always been part of it. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had this solid foundation of people who actually gave a damn about me. The wedding was small, maybe 60 people. I remember standing there, watching Chloe walk down the aisle, thinking I'd somehow locked into the exact life I'd been working toward. 6 months after the wedding, we bought a house, a 3-bedroom with a yard. We both agreed we'd need the space once kids came along. And that's when the baby conversation started getting really serious. Chloe brought it up constantly. She'd see a stroller at Target, and suddenly we'd be talking about cribs and pediatricians. I loved that she was so excited, because it meant we were on the same page about our future. We started trying about 4 months after we moved in. At first, it felt like this fun, intimate secret we were sharing. But then, month after month kept passing with nothing happening. She started tracking her cycle obsessively, using apps and ovulation tests. I could see her getting more stressed every time her period showed up. I tried to stay supportive, telling her these things take time, that we shouldn't worry yet. But she'd just shake her head and say she had this feeling something was wrong. Around the 6-month mark, I suggested we both see a doctor, just to make sure everything was working right. And that's when things got weird. Every time I brought up scheduling appointments, she'd have a reason why we should wait. She'd say it was too expensive, even though our insurance covered it. Or claim her schedule at the dental office was too crazy. Or insist we should try for a full year first, because that's what some articles said. I didn't push too hard. I didn't want to add pressure to what was already becoming a stressful situation. But looking back, I should have noticed how she'd get almost defensive whenever I mentioned doctors. The really strange part was how she'd cycle between being devastated about not getting pregnant and then making these little comments that felt off. Like one time after a negative test, she looked at me and said, maybe I should get checked out, implying it was me, because her mom had 3 kids with no problems. It was subtle enough that I brushed it off as frustration talking, but it planted this tiny seed of doubt in my mind that I couldn't quite shake. We kept trying for another year. The whole time, she maintained this performance of someone desperate to be a mom, crying over pregnancy announcements from friends, talking about baby names, even buying little outfits she'd hide in the closet for when it finally happened. And I believed every bit of it. Why wouldn't I? This was my wife, the person I'd chosen to build a life with. The idea that she might be lying about something this fundamental never even crossed my mind. But then one night, everything changed, because of a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. I'd gotten home from work earlier than usual, around 5 instead of 6, and I heard her voice coming from our bedroom upstairs. The door was mostly closed, but not latched. I was about to call out to let her know I was home when I caught part of what she was saying. She was talking to someone, her voice low and careful. And I heard her say these exact words, "He still has no idea." If he'd gotten tested, everything would have blown up. I stood there in the hallway, frozen, trying to process what I'd just heard. She kept talking, something about keeping things separate, about being careful. And then she laughed, this light, almost carefree laugh that made my stomach drop. I backed away slowly, went downstairs, and deliberately made noise opening and closing the front door, like I'd just arrived. By the time she came down, her face was perfectly normal. She kissed me hello and asked about my day like nothing had happened. I played along, going through the motions of our evening routine, but my mind was spinning. That one sentence kept replaying over and over. If he'd gotten tested, everything would have blown up. That night, after I heard the phone call, I barely slept. My brain kept running through every possible explanation for what she'd said, and none of them were good. I'm an engineer. When something doesn't add up, I can't just ignore it and hope it resolves itself. I need data. I need to understand the system. And right then, the system was my marriage, and it clearly had a malfunction I hadn't detected. The next morning, I went to work like normal, sat at my desk, staring at CAD models I was supposed to be reviewing. Instead, I found myself Googling fertility clinics in Dallas that took walk-ins. I picked one about 40 minutes from our house, far enough that I wouldn't accidentally run into anyone we knew. I called during my lunch break to schedule an appointment. The receptionist asked if my wife would be coming too, and I said, no, just me for now. It felt like the first actively deceptive thing I'd done in our entire marriage. The appointment was set for that Friday. I told Chloe I had an off-site meeting with a contractor, which wasn't even a particularly creative lie, but she didn't question it. I showed up at the clinic feeling ridiculous, because part of me still hoped this was all some massive misunderstanding. Maybe I'd misheard her, or taken something out of context. But I needed to know for sure. They did the standard tests, gave me the awkward instructions in the collection room that smelled like industrial cleaning products, and told me the results would take about a week. That week was torture. I had to act completely normal at home while internally I was preparing for my entire life to potentially explode. And Chloe kept doing her usual routine, checking her ovulation app, suggesting we try again soon. When the results came back, I drove to the clinic during my lunch break, sat in the parking lot, and opened the envelope. Everything was normal. Actually, better than normal. The doctor had written a note saying my counts were well above average, and there was no indication of any fertility issues on my end whatsoever. I sat there staring at those numbers, feeling this cold weight settle in my chest. Because now I knew for certain that she'd been lying. And if I wasn't the problem, then what the hell had we really been doing for the past 2 years? I didn't confront her, not yet. I'm methodical. I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before I made any moves. That's when I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. And I realized our entire marriage had been full of small details I'd dismissed as normal. She went to the pharmacy every month to pick up a prescription. Whenever I asked what it was for, she'd give vague answers about vitamins or something for her skin. Now, those answers felt deliberately evasive. One evening, when she was in the shower, I checked the medicine cabinet and found nothing. Strange, I thought, until I realized she must be keeping whatever it was somewhere else. A few days later, she left her purse on the kitchen counter while she ran out to grab the mail. I looked inside and found a pill pack, the kind with days of the week labeled on the back. When I Googled the name printed on the foil, it came back as a common oral contraceptive. My hands started shaking as I put everything back exactly how I'd found it. She'd been taking birth control the whole time we were supposedly trying for a baby. Every tearful conversation, every disappointed moment, every discussion about what might be wrong, completely fabricated. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. But I forced myself to stay calm and keep digging, because I needed to know how deep this went. I started checking our bank statements more carefully, going back through months of transactions I'd barely glanced at before. We'd always kept our finances mostly joint. I'd trusted her completely. I found charges to hotels in Plano, restaurants I'd never been to, and several payments to places that seemed random until I started mapping them out. There was a pattern. Roughly every 2 weeks, she'd have expenses that didn't match up with her work schedule or the evenings she'd told me she was out with friends. I'm an engineer, so I did what engineers do. I created a spreadsheet and logged every suspicious transaction with dates, amounts, and locations. One charge stood out. A boutique hotel in uptown Dallas on an afternoon 3 months earlier, when she told me she was at a continuing education seminar for dental hygienists. I called the hotel, pretending to follow up on a corporate booking. They confirmed they had no seminars or group events that day, which meant she'd lied about where she was and what she was doing. I also pulled our insurance statements, because I wanted to see if there were any doctor visits she hadn't mentioned. That's when I found regular appointments at a women's health clinic starting about 2 years ago, right around when we'd started trying. The billing codes indicated contraceptive counseling and prescription refills. This wasn't some recent decision or moment of doubt. She'd been actively preventing pregnancy from the very beginning, while performing this elaborate charade. At this point, I knew there was probably someone else. All the hotel charges and careful scheduling suggested she was meeting someone regularly, and I needed to figure out who. I started paying attention to when she was on her phone. I noticed she'd tilt the screen away from me, or take it into another room to text, which she'd never done before. One Saturday morning, she was in the shower and left her phone on the nightstand. I picked it up, knowing I was crossing a line, but feeling like that line had already been obliterated by everything else I'd discovered. She had it locked with a passcode, but I knew it was her mom's birthday. She'd told me years ago when we first started dating. And she'd apparently never changed it, because she never thought she'd need to hide anything from me. I opened her messages and immediately saw a thread with someone named Michael. No last name, just Michael with a blue heart emoji next to it. The messages were exactly what you'd expect: inside jokes, plans to meet up, references to things they'd done together that made it crystal clear this wasn't some innocent friendship. There were messages about being careful, about making sure I didn't suspect anything, about how she was handling the situation at home. Reading them felt like being punched in the stomach over and over. I took screenshots of everything, sent them to my own email from her phone, then deleted the sent messages, and put her phone back exactly where I'd found it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might actually pass out. But I managed to leave the bedroom and act normal when she came out, wrapped in a towel, asking what I wanted for breakfast. The next step was finding out who this guy actually was. That turned out to be easier than I expected, because people are shockingly careless about their digital footprints. I went through the messages again on my own phone and found enough context clues to narrow it down. Then I checked Chloe's Instagram followers and found a Michael who worked in real estate and lived in Plano, exactly where most of those hotel charges were located. He had the kind of profile that screamed midlife crisis, lots of gym selfies and photos at expensive restaurants. And in a few of them, I could see Chloe in the background, carefully cropped, but definitely there. I had one more thing I needed to do before I decided how to handle this: see them together with my own eyes. I spent the next week paying attention to her schedule. When she told me she was meeting a girlfriend for brunch on Sunday, I decided to follow her. She drove to a coffee shop in Plano, and I parked 3 rows back with a clear view of the entrance. About 10 minutes later, Michael showed up in a BMW that probably cost more than my annual salary, and they sat outside on the patio, having coffee and laughing like any normal couple would. I took photos on my phone, nothing fancy, just clear shots of them together. And then I watched as they got up, walked to their cars, and drove separately to the same hotel I'd seen charged on our credit card. I didn't follow them inside, because I didn't need to see that part. I already knew what was happening. And honestly, I'd seen enough to make me physically sick. I sat in my car for about 20 minutes, just staring at the hotel entrance, trying to process the fact that my entire marriage had been a lie. Then I drove to a lawyer's office. I'd done my research during the week and found someone who specialized in divorce cases, a woman named Rebecca, who had excellent reviews and seemed to handle things discreetly. I called ahead and she'd agreed to see me that afternoon, which felt like the universe finally giving me something that worked in my favor. I brought my folder of evidence, the fertility test results showing I was fine, the pharmacy records I'd pulled from our insurance, the bank statements with hotel charges, the screenshots of messages with Michael, and the photos I'd just taken that morning. I laid it all out on her desk. Rebecca looked through everything carefully, made notes, asked clarifying questions. Then she looked up at me with this expression that was equal parts sympathy and professional focus. She told me that what Chloe had done could potentially be considered fraud in the inducement, especially since I could prove she'd married me under false pretenses about wanting children. The evidence of the affair, combined with the financial deception and the deliberate use of contraception while claiming fertility issues, would work heavily in my favor. We discussed strategy, timelines, and what I could expect. Rebecca explained that Texas is a no-fault divorce state, but that fraud and financial misconduct could still impact asset division and spousal support. By the end of that meeting, I had a clear plan forward, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over my situation. Rebecca said she'd start preparing the paperwork immediately and that we'd serve Chloe at her workplace in about 2 weeks, which would prevent her from having advance warning or time to hide assets or coordinate a response. I left that office feeling something I hadn't felt since I'd heard that phone call, a sense of purpose. Because now I wasn't just the guy being lied to and mistreated. I was the guy who'd quietly gathered every piece of evidence and was about to flip the entire situation on its head. I went home that evening, had dinner with my wife like nothing was wrong, and watched her check her phone and smile at messages I knew were from him. She asked how my day was, and I told her it was fine, just the usual work stuff. And inside, I was thinking about how in less than 2 weeks, her entire world was going to collapse, and she'd have no one to blame but herself. The paperwork was ready within 2 weeks. Rebecca suggested we serve Chloe at her dental office on a Wednesday afternoon, because it would catch her completely off guard and prevent her from having time to coordinate a response or destroy evidence. I agreed. At that point, I was done playing nice. And honestly, part of me wanted her to feel even a fraction of the humiliation I'd felt discovering her lies. The process server showed up at her work around 2 in the afternoon, handed her the envelope in front of her coworkers and patients in the waiting area. Apparently, she went pale and had to excuse herself to the bathroom. I know this because her mom, Susan, called me about an hour later, voice shaking, asking what was happening and why Chloe had just been served divorce papers at work. I kept my tone calm and told her that Chloe knew exactly why, and if she wanted details, she should ask her daughter. Susan tried to press me for more information, saying I owed them an explanation after everything they'd done for me. But I simply said I'd explain everything when the time was right and ended the call. Chloe came home around 6 that evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, working on some design specs like it was any other night. She walked in with the papers clutched in her hand, mascara smudged under her eyes. I could tell she'd been crying for hours. She threw the papers on the table and started asking what the hell I was doing, and why I was throwing away our marriage over nothing, her voice coming out as this desperate, shaky whisper. I closed my laptop slowly, looked at her, and slid a folder across the table, the same folder I'd shown Rebecca, packed with bank statements, pharmacy records, photos of her with Michael, and my own fertility test results. I told her to open it. As she flipped through page after page, I watched her face cycle through confusion, then recognition, then something close to panic. She tried to recover, saying I'd invaded her privacy and that I had no right to go through her things. But I cut her off. I said she'd invaded our marriage with lies, and privacy stops being a shield when you're committing fraud. She switched tactics then, going from defensive to emotional, claiming she could explain everything and that the situation with Michael wasn't what it looked like. But I was prepared for this. I wasn't going to let her manipulate her way out. I asked her point blank to explain the birth control prescription she'd been taking for 2 years while we were supposedly trying for a baby. She froze. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried to say it was complicated, that she'd been confused about what she wanted, that she was going to tell me eventually. I let her talk herself in circles for a few minutes before I said the only thing that mattered was that she'd lied about something fundamental, wasted 2 years of my life, and betrayed every promise she'd made. That's when she snapped. All the fake tears dried up instantly. Her whole face changed, and she looked at me with this cold anger I'd never seen before, and said words I'll never forget, "You're not man enough to be a dad anyway." She said it like she'd been holding it back for years, like she'd finally found permission to say what she really thought. And she kept going, saying I was too rigid, too boring, too focused on plans and systems to ever be the kind of father any kid would want. She said Michael understood her in ways I never could, that he was spontaneous and exciting, and that she'd stayed with me because I was stable and safe, but she'd never actually been happy. I just sat there and let her say it all, because I wanted her to show exactly who she really was. And when she finally ran out of steam, I told her calmly that she'd just made my lawyer's job a whole lot easier. Her face went white again as she realized what she'd done. She tried to backtrack, saying she didn't mean it and that she was just upset, but the damage was done, and we both knew it. The divorce process took about 3 months, which is relatively fast. During that time, Chloe tried everything to slow it down or negotiate better terms. She wanted to keep the house, wanted me to pay her spousal support, wanted to split assets 50-50, despite the fact that I'd paid for most of them and she'd been living a lie. Rebecca shut down every attempt with surgical precision, presenting the evidence of fraud, the affair, and the fact that Chloe had been actively deceiving me throughout our marriage. The hearing itself was almost anticlimactic, because once the judge saw the pharmacy records showing she'd been on birth control while claiming we had fertility issues, combined with the photos of her with Michael and the pattern of deceptive spending, there wasn't much left to argue. Chloe's lawyer tried to claim that birth control didn't prove intent to deceive, and that the affair started after our marriage had already broken down. But Rebecca countered with time-stamped messages and transaction records that showed otherwise. The judge actually used the word fraud in his remarks, saying that deliberately preventing pregnancy while claiming to pursue it constituted a fundamental deception that voided any claim to marital equity. The final judgment gave me the house, required her to remove her belongings within 30 days, denied her request for any spousal support, and ordered her to pay a portion of my legal fees. I walked out of that courtroom feeling like I'd just finished the hardest project of my life. And in a way, I had. The aftermath was messy in ways I hadn't expected. Chloe's whole life seemed to fall apart after the divorce was finalized. I heard through a mutual friend who still talked to her that Michael wanted nothing to do with her once she was actually available. Turns out he was only interested when she was someone else's wife, and the relationship had that forbidden excitement attached to it. She tried reaching out to me multiple times, sending long, apologetic texts about how she'd made mistakes and wanted a chance to explain herself properly. But I never responded. Her parents reached out too. That conversation was harder, because Robert and Susan had always been good to me. And I could hear the genuine shame in Robert's voice when he called to apologize for not raising his daughter better. I told him he'd done his best, and that this wasn't his failure, it was hers. He thanked me for that kindness, even though I'm not sure he believed it. Susan sent me a card a few weeks later, saying she understood why I'd done what I did and that she was sorry for everything. That was more closure than I expected, but appreciated nonetheless. About 6 months after everything was finalized, I was grabbing coffee before work when I saw Chloe across the shop with some guy I didn't recognize. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. She saw me too, and for a second our eyes met. I could see she wanted to come over and say something. But I just grabbed my coffee and left, because there was nothing left to say. My life now is quieter than it was. I've got the house to myself. I've been putting more time into work and hobbies I'd neglected, and I'm genuinely okay with where things are. Some people ask if I'm dating again, or if I'm ready to try for that family I'd always wanted. And honestly, I don't know yet. What I do know is that I'm not going to compromise on honesty or settle for someone who sees me as a safety net instead of a partner. She said I wasn't man enough to be a dad. And maybe in her twisted logic, she believed that. But I was man enough to see through the deception, gather the evidence, walk away with my dignity intact, and protect the future I still want to build. That's the kind of strength that actually matters. And it's the kind I'll teach my kids someday, when I'm ready to have them with someone who actually deserves that future. What do you think? Was there anything I could have done differently?